Very good. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in to this round table discussion. Before we get started, I must say to the panelists, this is not a debate, so we do expect you to actually answer the questions. So I know it's kind of a new thing in America, but we are hoping to get the questions answered today. Quickly go through our panelists. Lingling Wei is a senior China correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and co-author of Superpower Showdown: How to Battle Between Trump and Xi Threatens a New Cold War. Bill Bishop is a publisher of Sinocism, a daily newsletter about China with thousands of subscribers. David Firestein is the inaugural president and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations, and Chris Fenton served as president of DMG Entertainment Motion Picture Group, and also has his recent book, which I do not have in my notes here. It's around here somewhere, Feeding the Dragon. So we will be sure when we send out this, if you have to hop out, you will get a notification with the replay. You can get access to that, and we will send out links to all of our panelists and where you can find them at. Okay. As we said in the outline, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to give each panelist 3 minutes to kind of talk about where we're at in U.S.-China relations. But I want to set the tone with this. This is from May 10th of 2000 from Brookings. And going back to the end, it says, and what has been described as its most important vote this year, the U.S. Congress will soon decide whether to provide permanent normal trade relations to China. A vote is required because after 14 years of negotiations, China is poised to enter the World Trade Organization. Assuming China concludes its bilateral negotiations with the European Union by June or July, entry is likely before the end of the year. The cornerstone principle of the WTO is that members provide each other unconditional most favored nation trade status, now called permanent normal trade relations. In U.S. trade law, current U.S. law precludes granting permanent normal trade relations to China. As a result, President Clinton has asked Congress to amend the law. Now, that was May of 2000. We are now 20 years removed from that. I'll start with Ling. What's happened since then? Obviously, a lot. Where are we at? And what are some of the obstacles that we're facing from your perspective? And we're going to give each panelist about 3 minutes.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's obviously a great opportunity to share views and ideas about U.S.-China relationship with some of the best experts in this field. So, as you mentioned, Ryan, I co-authored the book, Superpower Showdown, with my colleague in Washington, Bob Davis. So when we were writing this book, the subtitle we came up was how the battle between Trump and Xi threatens the new Cold War. But for now, we are already in a new Cold War, in my opinion, probably 5 inches in. So, really how exactly this relationship has soured so fast and has, worsened to such a level. This is, what our book tried to answer, basically providing people with a roadmap to what we're seeing today and what likely will happen going forward. If you guys don't mind, I just want to use this opportunity to share with you a couple key takeaways from our book. First of all, the relationship, the souring of the relationship really didn't start with President Trump and didn't start with President Xi Jinping either. It went all the way back to actually the global financial crisis. That was also the height of the U.S.-China relationship. Both George H.W. Bush and Chinese leader Hu Jintao at the time worked very closely together. Bush called Hu Jintao twice in 1 month. Once was to convince him not to sell any U.S. Treasury bonds. The other time was trying to get Hu Jintao to come to Washington to, attend a meeting. Bush was hosting the G20 meeting in terms of how to combat the global financial crisis. Both times, Hu Jintao agreed and worked President Bush in terms of coordinating stimulus plans to help not only individual economy, but the global economy out of recession. So that was the height of the relationship. It also marked a turning point for the relationship. From at that time, the two countries really started to diverge. China grew increasingly. That was basically a wake-up call for China in a sense that, our model really worked. Our China model, our path was really the right path. The U.S. was no longer a model to emulate for China, at least economically. So China started to pursue a more aggressive, inward-looking policy, as evidenced by Made in China 2025 plan that was issued later after President Xi Jinping came to power. So that was one, inflection point in the bilateral relationship we really try to explain. And the other thing we try to convey in the book is really, maybe the souring of the relationship is inevitable in one sense, but also on the other sense, looking at it the other way, personalities also drives politics, and that's another key point we try to show. On one hand, we have a very aggressive American president, bent on holding China accountable. On the other side, we have also a very aggressive Chinese leader, probably the most aggressive, most ideologically driven China's leader in recent history. In the past, for Chinese leaders, economy trumped ideology. Not anymore. Under Xi Jinping, ideology purity is the center of his agenda. So he's moved the party, the state, back into the front and center of the Chinese society. And his China Dream agenda basically is make China great again. There are a lot of similarities between his agenda and Trump's make America great again agenda, and those two agendas inevitably clash, and putting those two countries onto this collision course. So anyway, obviously this year, despite a short period of calmness as a result of the signing of the Phase 1 trade agreement, COVID-19 happened. Just totally further deepened the mistrust on each side. And another dramatic action was that taken by Beijing, imposed a Hong Kong national security law on Hong Kong. So one thing after another, we just saw Washington, hardly a week goes by without some new action, new sanction aimed at Chinese officials or Chinese companies. So you see these two countries, the list of confrontation just growing longer and longer. That what started out as a trade war is now, in my view, really has evolved into a new Cold War that involves confrontation on almost every field. Thank you.
There we go. Okay, Bill, I subscribe to your newsletter. Big fan. You cover this daily, in depth. Give us your perspective.
Sure. Well, thanks, and good to see everybody. And I agree completely with Ling Ling. I think I'd start out by saying I actually don't like the term "New Cold War" because I think it doesn't really describe what's necessarily happening with China. And I think the original Cold War was so much different than what we're going into with China. I prefer to go using sort of a variant of Xi Jinping's view of things. I like to call it the new era of U.S.-China relations. I think we've passed through the engagement era, and now we're into something that is going to be much more fraught and much more filled with friction, confrontation, and potentially conflict. And as Li Ling said, this is something that the downward trajectory relationship is something that really was occurring long before President Trump became president. I think there is, from an official U.S. government perspective, I think one of the watershed moments was the 2017 December national security strategy that really reframed the view of China, the U.S. government's views towards China, And so on the U.S. side, I think that's an important marker. But again, it was just a reflection, I think, of the reality that had been building for many years. And so I think anyone who believes that things are going to get back to normal, whatever normal may be, if there is a new U.S. president in January 2021, I think is really needs to set aside those illusions. Again, I agree with Ling. Much of the shift can be credited to Xi Jinping and his vision for the PRC, both domestically and in the world. But in fact, he's really able to push much of what he's doing because of deeper trends inside China and the Communist Party that have been there for decades. Fundamentally, the Communist Party espouses a set of goals and values that are in many ways inimical to U.S. interests and values. And so as we see that Xi is putting the party back front and center, and we see him significantly hardening the party's domestic and external views, as the PRC's relative strength is increasing across just about every dimension, including militarily in terms of modernization and reform, it's much harder to see how there can be how the U.S. can in any way shape or change that trajectory without a pretty significant amount of costs. Inside China, I think one of the things that I find very worrisome is that the space for any remaining or sort of moderating views within the Communist Party looks like it's rapidly constricted under Xi Jinping. And I think that's by Xi's design. That's a feature, not a bug of the system. In some ways, you could say the same thing about what's happening in the discourse here in DC, although obviously there's a lot more public debate about what's going on in China. But again, the bipartisanship here in DC, frankly, in China may be the one thing in DC that there's actual bipartisanship about. And so again, when you look at whether or not there's a change in the president in 2021, it's very unlikely you're going to see any sort of changes in DC and sort of the congressional views towards China. Inside China, the idea that the U.S. is trying to keep us down and contain us is something that has for a long time had a lot of traction. And I think that, again, that's something I last lived in China from 2005 to 2015. And I'd spent a bunch of time there before that from the late 80s. And, a lot of my friends, my Chinese friends, were really, like me, part of the engagement cohort. And one of the things that really struck me, even in 2014 and 2015 especially, was this sense that the U.S. is trying to keep us down, this is an idea that has a lot of traction inside the PRC, and that really feeds into, I think, what we see these longer term trends of increasing nationalism, if not in some cases outright jingoism. So I think when we look at the U.S.-China relationship, though, it's important to note, and I think there was a Pew survey this week that sort of really highlights this, that the friction is not just with the U.S., it's with many of the countries, many of the developing world countries. And I think Beijing's the negative views towards Beijing and towards China and towards Xi Jinping are really kind of off the charts. And a lot of that may have to do with the pandemic. Certainly some of it has to do with Hong Kong, Xinjiang. But in general, I think when you look at U.S.-China relations, when you look at, we'll talk about this later, but the incomplete list of issues that look increasingly intractable include South China Sea, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, the pandemic, sort of the technology contest, technology war, whatever we're going to call it, the PRC's efforts around global governance and global discourse. I think, in terms of how we improve things, one of the things I find very worrisome is the official Chinese line, publicly and privately over the last several months, is that the U.S. is to blame for everything, right? China's done nothing wrong, and the U.S. has to come back to the proper course or proper stance in a relationship. That view is not going to be conducive to finding constructive path forward, whether it's a second term of a Trump administration or the first term of a Biden administration. So again, I apologize if I sound pessimistic, but as the Chinese say, seek truth from facts, and right now most of those facts are not pointing to happier times ahead in the relationship.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to you, David.
Ryan, thanks so much. I really appreciate it, and it's an honor to be on this program with all of you. Let me just make a few comments in terms of my overall assessment and maybe pick up on a couple of themes that have been mentioned by the other guests. First of all, I think needless to say, I I take the view, as I think many others do, that the U.S.-China relationship today is at a modern era low point. Any number of metrics, I think, could be used to substantiate that assertion. But I think that probably the most obvious data point is the very fact that the United States would see fit to close the Consulate General of China in Houston, and that China would, in a tit-for-tat measure, then close the U.S. Consulate General in Chengdu. That's just something that doesn't happen in a normal, functional bilateral diplomatic relationship, and yet it's happened here. And I think it's indicative of the dramatic degree to which the United States-China relationship has deteriorated in recent years, but even specifically in recent weeks and months. So I think we are at a modern era low. I think there are a number of different reasons for that. I would say that there is responsibility on both sides for the relationship being where it is today. Unquestionably, there are things that China has done that are extremely problematic from an American perspective. And China has, in many ways, I think, acted provocatively and done things that it knew would be problematic from a U.S. vantage. And I think China bears responsibility for those actions and those policy postures. By the same token, I think the United States has done things and reacted to certain Chinese policies in a way that have also escalated things and at times also been provocative. And so I think there is a mutually reinforcing dynamic in the way that the two countries interact with each other that has kind of ratcheted up tensions to the place where we see them today. I will say that just to reference the vice presidential debate that took place last night between Vice President Pence and Senator Kamala Harris, one of the things that stood out to me in that I think is emblematic of a broader point that I would make is that there was a question about China. So one of the 10-minute segments in the 90-minute debate per the moderator was about China. And yet there was virtually no substance offered by either side, a little bit more by Kamala Harris than by Mike Pence. But speaking about Pence, as the sitting vice president, as one of the leading spokesmen for the administration, obviously, and for the administration's approach to China, I was quite stunned by the fact that he basically made no mention whatsoever in any substantive way about success that the administration has had with its approach over the last nearly 4 years to China. And when offered the layup and the opportunity to kind of address the issue forthrightly and say, here's what we've done as an administration, Vice President Pence, the only thing that he was able to think of, evidently, and the only thing that he said was that President Trump shut down travel from China at the outset, from a U.S. perspective, of the COVID-19 pandemic, but he made no mention whatsoever of trade policies and bottom line results for the American people. I think that's very telling. I think if, as points that I'll perhaps make later in the conversation, but if this administration were having success with its approach to China, I think it would be talking about that success. And I think the fact that it makes no mention of the bottom line results of any of its policies toward China is remarkably telling. And frankly, it's a very damning indictment of the Trump administration's approach to China. That being said, China also has its issues, and it's done a whole range of things that I think are immensely problematic and that I think the U.S. government regards as problematic. And I think as a result, we see the relationship in a place that is very, very difficult, very challenging. Just a couple of points. I too would disagree with the notion of a Cold War framing per se. I worked in Russia and worked on U.S.-Russia relations for a good swath of my career. I understand the concept of the Cold War per se, that existed between the U.S. and its bloc and the Soviet Union and its bloc. And I think that the dynamic between the United States and China today lacks a number of central features of the Cold War. There are some features that I think are present, for example, the notion of a zero-sum mentality, but there are a lot of other features, including, for example, the absence of massive nuclear arsenals pointed toward each other, a real prospect of nuclear Armageddon, two military blocs, not just nations, but blocs that are aligned against each other, guerrilla warfare in the developing world, and the list could go on. There are a lot of ways that I think the current state of affairs, difficult and severely strained though it is not does not rise to the level of a Cold War per se. With respect to Bill's point about bipartisanship, I think he's exactly right. There is a bipartisan consensus in the United States, seemingly, and it's evidenced in 535 to 0 votes in the United States Congress on a number of pieces of China-related legislation. And there is a bipartisan sense that China absolutely poses a competitive challenge to the United States. According to the Pew Research Center, 26% of this country, of the American people, regard China as a, quote, enemy, unquote, of the United States. Of course, 74% therefore don't. But nevertheless, that's a high and striking number. But I will say that I think there also is perhaps a bit of an artificial skewing in those negatives toward China that we see now, with, according to recent polling, about 2/3 of the American public holding unfavorable views about China. There is an artificial skewing, I think, because I think a lot of people, particularly people in Washington, on both sides of the partisan aisle, but I would say especially on the Republican side, where the criticism is heaviest and harshest, I think they feel there would be an immense political cost to pay for saying anything about China that is remotely moderate, let alone, God forbid, pro-China. And so I think what you have is a skewing of the debate in the terms of the debate to an extremely harsh and severe position on China, but one that probably goes beyond where a lot of people are actually in their hearts. Some people feel that way authentically. Others, I think, are going along for the ride because it's the politically expedient thing to do. And the one data point that I would cite that I think illustrates that before I close here is that in the recent Pew Research Center poll on U.S. sentiments toward China, very extensive, very authoritative. They do this longitudinally over years and decades. And the most recent version that came out about a month ago, despite a serious decline in U.S. or deterioration in U.S. public sentiment toward China, there still is a statistically significant majority, according to the Pew Research Center, who favor engaging China economically over, quote, getting tough on China. And I think that is telling that depending on how you phrase the question, things may not be quite as bleak as they seem. They are bleak, but they may not be quite as bleak as they seem. But I think I fully agree the prospects, near-term prospects for the U.S.-China relationship are grim. The election is a critical data point. We'll see what happens on November 3rd. I do agree with Bill that in any case, you're not going to see a sea change in policy, even if Joe Biden were to win the presidency. That being said, there will be some changes around rhetoric, tonality, and in a couple of substantive cases, some policy change, including, again, if Biden wins, a major shift on the U.S. approach to tariffs on Chinese imports. That being said, I think it's going to be a long slog, and I think there are a lot of challenges and a lot of things that all of us need to work on to try to keep a very consequential bilateral relationship moving forward in the right direction.
Okay, Chris, close us out.
Yeah, well, I'm looking very forward to going off script, but I'll keep it brief and opening. And by the way, I'm excited that there's one other that thinks that we're not in a traditional Cold War, so that should be a good debate a little later here. I wrote a book called Feeding the Dragon. It is essentially about my applied expertise in the cultural and commercial space. So I come at it from an applied, practical standpoint. My point of view is from 20 years of doing that. And I just sort of say, like, we sort of have to face the facts. I mean, the marriage of superpowers look great on paper. Globalists and free market proponents seeking earnings growth and prospects of slowly democratizing the PRC eagerly arranged that marriage. The courtship began in 1972 when Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger first visited the 4,000-year-old nation. The relationship then blossomed for decades. It culminated, I think, in the 2008 Storybook Olympics, or the Storybook Wedding, which was the Beijing Olympics. And that's where we saw American sponsors, Coca-Cola, GE, Johnson & Johnson, McDonald's, Nike, Visa, athletes like LeBron James and Michael Phelps. They all arrived there with great fanfare to represent our nation's nuptial commitment to China. And even though Hollywood's presence was sort of absent at that period, it came on in great stance like later on after 2008. I sort of see the U.S.-China relationship, as I talk about in a lot of different lectures, is connected to like a cell phone connects to a cell tower. In the perfect scenario that globalists hope for, there's 5 bars of service that connect the two. I compare those 5 bars to 5 diplomatic forces that either connect or distance the two countries. Politics being one of them, national security, human rights, culture, and commerce. In the misguidedly arranged marriage between the U.S. and China, 3 of those forces never shared nor will share common ground, and that's politics, national security, and human rights. In fact, through issues that we're seeing, and Bill brought these up earlier, trade war, Hong Kong, Uyghur atrocities, Taiwan, cybersecurity issues, South China Sea conflict, supply chain disruption, and obviously COVID-19 crisis, the division affecting each force has never been more amplified. The best we can hope for is that both countries agree to disagree on each. And since these 3 absent forces represent a majority of the diplomatic glue necessary to hold the marriage together, I sort of highly recommend that the superpowers just file for divorce immediately. We just got to get to that phase. But in a way, we sort of have all these kids that are a product of this marriage. So I see it as we can make this split amicable. And why is that? Well, because the other 2 forces, culture and commerce, can continue to exist. Those remaining bars can keep our nations in a constructive relationship, continuing through the decoupling. They're capable of more change than presidential visits, parades, political speeches, and even military force. I even say in my book, you could argue that Big Macs, David Hasselhoff, rock ballads from the Scorpions, and so on, they had more to do to end the Cold War than the arsenal of nuclear weapons. And my argument is that if they could end a Cold War, they surely could prevent one. So the diplomatic effect of all of this is very good. And it's definitely even good for business. It's really good for business. In fact, since the growing sino-consumption of America's best-in-class products and services creates jobs, that's good for America. And it also increases our gross domestic product. If we do it right, we have to rebalance this relationship for sure. And we talked about that WTO situation in 2000. I think we need to redefine exactly how China is designated now. I'm not sure if they're really a developing nation anymore. And I would argue Europe had the same problem with Alexander Hamilton and the way we handled our industrial revolution in the early 1800s. So the bottom line, the arranged marriage between the U.S. and China was well-intentioned, but the differences between the superpowers prohibit the nuptials from lasting. The exchange of commerce and culture, however, can apply 2 key forces of common ground, creating a glue for a strong post-divorce bond, utilizing new forces and new rules to make things fair. But if this exchange stops, and this is where the Cold War idea comes into effect in my head, if this exchange stops, culture and commerce no longer exists, then that final 2 bars of cell service between cell phone and cell tower go blank, and the connection just simply ends, and the world's superpowers just stop communicating. And that's when our new mighty Cold War begins, right? That Cold War was essentially there pre-1971, but China was a sleeping giant, so it didn't matter. But now they're going to be, well, they'll be the largest box office in the world this year, and they're going to be the largest economy in a matter of a year or 2, right? So we can't go into that same type of relationship, that frozen relationship that we had pre-1971. And if we do, that Cold War is going to always escalate, and it's never going to have an end in sight. So my point, my rainbows and unicorns, and my sort of mission right now with the book and the platform that's given me is I'm saying we must come together to keep that from happening. I have 2 13-year-olds. I have twins. They're golden pigs. They were born January of 2007. And I don't want them growing up in a Cold War environment like I had growing up as a kid and seeing The Day After, that miniseries that I think I was 11 years old, I saw and gave me nightmares for 5 straight years. I don't want that for them. So this is a challenge we must overcome. And I think we got to start doing it now. And part of that is talking about it like we are today. Thanks.
Okay, real quick. We did get one person note that we're getting some feedback. So I muted Bill and I muted Lingley. So I muted myself. So it's either David or Chris. One of you is getting some feedback on your end. There's some background noise we can hear. I don't know which one of you it is, but if you could just, you're muted now. I think it's David. Can you mute yourself real quick? We'll see. Yep, it was you, David. So we will forgive you. So we'll just so everyone's muted. So you get to unmute yourself when we come back on. Okay. want to take a few minutes here to kind of go back through some of the things that we said. So we talked a minute ago when I started off was Bill Clinton 20 years ago. I think everyone said on some level we are at the lowest point or close to the lowest point. In 20 years, we got to the lowest point. How long or how much work would it take to get back to where we were at least 20 years ago or maybe 10 years ago? Is this something that can be repaired over a steak dinner? Is this something that's going to take 2 or 3 presidential elections, a new House, a new Congress? I mean, what kind of work from the U.S. side and the China side will it take to get back to where we were at least 20 years ago if this is the low point? We'll start with you, Chris, since you got to go last time.
Wow, that's a tough question. Well, I would say, who's trying to get us back together again? I mean, if it's the globalist corporations, if it's the Hollywood industry, if it's sports, if it's, aerospace, if it's anybody with a globalist ambition to China, I would argue they could probably get us back to some semblance of continuing the path of destruction of the American middle class and national security issues pretty quickly. Why? Because they're completely motivated. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm a capitalist. I'm a free market capitalist. But if we don't put patriotism before capitalism, we're going to find ourselves in this rampant globalism mode. And if we continue down that path, it's just going to open the door more and more to China abusing the privilege and eventually sort of taking advantage of it like they have already. So I think it has to be a combo of people leading us in the right direction. One of it's going to be obviously the constituents and the populace of this country wanting an effective change. I mean, they need to realize that we have supply chain issues. We have middle class labor issues because of China. We have economic issues, as Lingling brought up regarding 2008. There were a lot of things that China took advantage of in that situation that have caused a lot of pain and suffering for a large part of this population. So that part of the population has to get past the idea that it can get really cheap goods and services at Walmart or Costco and realize like it's better to think Henry Ford and getting back some sort of a manufacturing class. And by the way, keep in mind, China is only responsible probably for 2.5 million manufacturing jobs, but out of all the manufacturing jobs we have, that's roughly 20% of them. So it's a very large decimation that was caused to our labor class, which is spilled into a very large part of our country and sort of the rancor towards China. Once we get the populace behind this idea of resetting, rebalancing the relationship, which I think they're getting there already, then the push has to be on investors, shareholders of these companies and saying, hey, look, we're going to back off on these quarterlies and pushing for constant growth of revenues and profits, which primarily is made by the massive growth of the China market. And we want you to pull back and start thinking about what's best for the country first, right? And companies then also have to create this narrative about why they're doing business in China and why it's good for America that they're doing business in China. Because quite frankly, the 20 years that I've been dealing with China was always about sell the government why you can get your product and service in there and why they should support it and give the wind to your back. And 2, figure out how to sell it to the consumer and make sure that the government's always supporting it. The third layer now is got to be U.S. companies telling the populace here in the U.S. why it's good for them to continue engaging with China and continuing to sell products and services in that market because it creates jobs here or it builds GDP growth or it spreads democratic principles and values into that country, whatever it is. But it needs to be a momentum build of how we're going to change this dynamic and what we're going to change it to. And quite frankly, I see it as a major populist movement. This is something that affects red and blue equally. And in fact, it probably affects 95% of red and 95% of blue, with only the very top layer that's really, truly benefiting from continuing what we're doing with China. So can we get back to what we had before? I would say, yes, we can. But isn't that our best interest? Definitely not. can we get to some sort of semblance of a strategic relationship that is also competitive with China, that's also thinking of America first and thinking patriotically? I think 100% we can, but we got to come together as a country to figure that out and work together to create the leverage in order to get that done.
David, I'm going to go to you next, and I want to add one thing when I do. One of the frustrations that I have, at least from my perspective, is while I might agree with a lot of what Chris says, it feels like the American population was kind of sold one narrative about going to China, working to China, and now as they kind of learn about what's been going on, there's a lot of confusion about that. So even as we try to rebalance and work towards this relationship, part of that seems to be maybe talking about the mistakes that we made in the past very openly and how it wasn't exactly how it was pitched to the public. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, Ryan, thank you. And a few points to make. First of all, to your first question, let me just share a thought or two about how we get back, if in fact we can get back to some kind of quote normal that resembles the old normal. It's a very difficult thing to do for the reasons that I think have been mentioned. But I think fundamentally, the through line of this administration's policies toward China and approach to China is the concept of reciprocity. Very simply, for a long time, there has been a lack of reciprocity. There has been an asymmetry, I would say a massive asymmetry in the U.S.-China relationship in a variety of ways. But for purposes here, the main emphasis that the United States and this administration has placed has been on the trade and investment relationship. In the commercial relationship between our two countries. So yes, there has been an unlevel playing field. And as long as that unlevel playing field exists, and it does exist, I suspect that there will continue to be a market politically in the United States for this notion of, quote, America first, unquote, or, quote, getting tough on China and so on. Those feelings have been there on the part of the United States business community dating back a long time, 10, 12 years probably, that U.S. corporate sentiment toward China has been deteriorating. Their level of frustration about the inequities or the asymmetries in the relationship, the lack of reciprocal openness, et cetera, have been building for a long period of time. And they've kind of bubbled to the surface over these last several years. So I think, to your question, I think that the dynamics of the U.S.-China relationship will shift somewhat, at least, recognizing that there are some pretty irreconcilable differences of ideology, philosophy, policy. Leaving that aside, because that is certainly true, I think there could be some significant improvement if and when China starts to, just to put it very simply, become approximately as open to U.S. goods and services as the United States has historically been open to Chinese goods and services. With all of that said, let me just make a couple of points. And that is, with respect to the notion of patriotism before capitalism, that's something that I hear Xi Jinping say. That's something that we hear China talk about all the time. It's in their official doctrine, the notion that companies, and in particular state-owned enterprises, owe an allegiance to their nation and perhaps to the party, rather than to the market, to their shareholders, et cetera. I don't ascribe to that view. I think the United States became the #1 economy in the world because we didn't do things that way, because we let corporate entities make decisions that were good for their shareholders and be guided by the profit motive. I am a believer in the market. I am a believer in the principle of comparative advantage. I do believe that the pie overall gets larger when countries trade because of the concept of comparative advantage. And there are a lot of things that one could say about that, but I don't think that the United States maintains its economic superpower and #1 in the world economic status by following the Chinese playbook and adopting some of China's worst practices as best practices to be emulated. The one other thing I would say in terms of manufacturing jobs, and we can talk about this more as we go into detail on trade and so on, is that under this president, according to the Trump administration, according to Trump administration official data in the public domain, we have lost net 237,000 manufacturing jobs since January 20th, 2017. That's the Trump administration's figure, not mine. So whatever it is that we're doing, or that this administration is doing with an eye toward, quote, saving manufacturing jobs, plainly and speaking factually and empirically, it's just not working. We have fewer manufacturing jobs today than we did on the day that President Trump took the oath of office. And so I think what we ultimately need to look at is not ideology and not kind of political sloganeering in terms of make America great again, make America first, and so forth and so on. I think what we need to look at are the bottom line results. How do we achieve the things that we say we want to achieve? And if we're not achieving them, how do we course correct so that we improve our chances of achieving those things? But I don't think President Trump said on January 20th, 2017, that his goal at the end of his term in office, first four-year term in office, would be to lose hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs. And yet that is exactly what has happened according to Trump administration data.
Okay, Langley, we'll go to you. And then Bill, when she's done, you can finish up this and we'll go on to our next topic.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Well, just really quickly. It seems like I was voted out using this term "new Cold War." So from now on, I'll start adopting what Bill how Bill described it, the new era of the U.S.-China relationship. If it's a new era, I would think it would be very hard to go back to where we were 20 years ago. I think the strategic rivalry between these two nations really is here to stay. Whoever in the White House for the next 4 or 8 years, for Xi Jinping, his top priority right now is a smooth ride into his third term, with all three of his titles firmly attached to his name. Those three titles are president, party chairman or party secretary, and the commander-in-chief of PLA. You might ask, who in China these days would, have the capabilities to mount a meaningful challenge to him? You're right, there's no one. There might be some resentment, frustration in the Chinese society or in the elite circles, but no faction or no force that is meaningful enough to really directly challenge him. However, this U.S.-China relationship is a huge risk for him. He really could be blamed for completely destroying the bilateral relationship if he really, go down that path. So as Bill and David and Crystal mentioned earlier, it takes two to tango. So far we only talked about one actor in this whole dance, which is the U.S. The ball is in China's court as well. Its own actions, its own moves and punch backs at the U.S. Those things all matter. It really, for someone like me who covered China for the past 10 years, I find it really puzzling that it has taken so long for the Chinese side to realize the kind of shift in thinking in the U.S. toward China, the bipartisan consensus Bill mentioned earlier. They still kind of diss that, I have to say. Just the other day, I remember this vivid conversation I had with a pretty high-level official. She was really, really curious to understand why the sentiment toward China has gone so negative. She's genuinely mystified why China has no friends. Chinese system has looked pretty good so far. The pandemic, the trade war, China has all, so far so good, has all survived all those problems, those crises. Why we have no friends? So I really think this sense of hubris in Beijing is still very much there. And in order for the relationship to keep going, we're not even talking about going back to the old point, to normal. Just keep going. Keep the thing. Keep a hot war from happening. China really has to realize, it's what is the kind of backlash as a result of its own actions, and really try to understand, why the U.S. is doing this. But so far, really just not seeing any signs of that. The Pew poll David just mentioned, a friend, a party friend in Beijing, he's sort of like elite circle kind of person, he's like, that's the rating of Xi Jinping. They just, people, there are some people who, aware of the situation enough to form this kind of opinions, but it just really still puzzles me why the top doesn't see it. I would be really surprised if Xi Jinping gets to see the poll, the Pew poll, or any reports, the New York Times excellent story about that poll, or the journal's coverage of that poll. I would be surprised if he gets to see it. If he gets to see it, it's a really good thing. But I'm really, really, I really wish he could get to see it, but I don't think that's likely. But anyway, my point is, I agree with the other speakers. Good really insightful opinions about the U.S. How difficult it is for the two sides to mend the fences. My hope is really, let's just admit the problems right now. Both sides have looked at each other as strategic adversaries now. That's not going to change anytime soon. So just come up with a pragmatic way of keep this relationship going. Without really, trying to minimize the risks of a hot war as much as we can. I would think that would be, kind of a realistic hope for me, for us, for the near future. Thank you.
Thanks. No, I agree. I think to your last suggestion, again, if it's a Biden administration, I think certainly one of the things they would want to figure out how to do is basically drop the list of maybe they call it the U.S. core interest or the U.S. red lines, and basically just have a put it on the table meeting with Youngkish or somebody, and basically say, here are the areas where we have our fundamental problems. What are we going to do about it? And see how the Chinese react. And one of the questions is, how will the Chinese react? Because as I said, and as you said, the Chinese are not reacting in a way that allows them to say they've done anything wrong. And I think a lot of that flows from the domestic political environment that Xi Jinping has created. And to your point, who would dare to show Xi Jinping his global poll rating? I mean, speaking of, you said he wants to keep his titles attached. Well, whoever presents at the Xi might worry about whether they keep their head attached, right? And so, no, I mean, sort of joking, but maybe not. And so the question then is, it is that question of information flows, because I've had probably similar conversations you've had over the years with people here in DC and Beijing who are very Chinese people and very much involved in the U.S.-China relationship in official capacities, who don't understand. We try to walk them through, why this is happening and where it may go. And I had somebody a couple months ago finally say, God, we all thought you were so pessimistic, but you were like optimistic as to sort of where things have come out. And it's just this fundamental, and I think it's not fair to blame like Ambassador Cui here in DC, or it's just, there's some fundamental problem in the system that is blocking or not allowing information to flow, that I think is really causing what, at least to us, looks like pretty poor set of decisions in terms of how to manage the U.S.-China relationship. And, as you said, I think the U.S.-China relationship, Xi, and lots of the party discourse now is about the sort of changes unseen in a century, sort of where a lot of the, conversation or commentary in the West about Xi using this term is, oh, they see so many risks. They also see so many opportunities. At least Xi, I think, sees opportunities where the world order is in the process of being reshuffled. And they were saying this before the pandemic. The pandemic has obviously changed things even more. And so they see an opportunity for China and how China, China's role in the world is changing and will grow. But at the same time, the U.S.-China relationship, as Ling Ling said, I think is a key risk for Xi, because you've got real pain for the Chinese economy if there is decoupling. You have real pain for some Chinese elite if there's personal decoupling, and including current and retired politicians and their families who don't want to see this happening. But as you said, Ling, there's grumbling, but there's no mechanism to turn that grumbling into anything that seems like it could restrain Xi Jinping. You know, one of the things I heard a fair amount from, friends, one of whom who said, how do we get President Trump like a kilogram of chongcao, right? The cordyceps, right? Because we're worried about his health. This was 3 years ago, because we want to keep him alive to pressure Xi. This idea that actually, if the U.S. forced Xi into a position where he effectively breaks the U.S.-China relationship, that would actually cause some sort of backlash inside the party that might pull China back from what I think a lot of the elites saw then, maybe now, but I'm not sure, saw as a really risky approach to sort of China's growing role in the world. The pandemic changes a lot of things. The reality is we look like idiots here in America, and so people who maybe were not happy with Xi in the party, even at the beginning of this year, all of a sudden say, hey, well, wait a minute, yeah, we got a lot of problems, but we're alive, and we just, 500 million of us just went on vacation in the last week and nobody got sick. And the White House is like, ground zero of the third wave. I mean, it's funny, but it's not. It's pathetic, right? But this is how it's so hard to sort of figure out where things are, how they're shifting. But the reality is, and this goes back to the American view, is, we need a little more humility here, right? The reality is we fundamentally, this relationship isn't going to change or break in the way that the U.S. wants it unless we clean up our own act on many levels. I'll leave it there. I'm sure that'll piss somebody off, but.
I was just going to add, Ryan, really quick, just one thing that we don't have that really creates more problems than it should is the fact that we're not unified on the United States side of things. I mean, if we're negotiating a trade pact with the United States at one level, but then at the executive branch, right? But then we have senators that are yelling and screaming at C-suites that are continuing to do business with China under the laws of the land. Where is the unification on that? Like, we need something that essentially lays the groundwork of what we're doing with China, how we can engage with them. And then everybody's got to back off of the companies that are doing it under the laws of the land, because now what's happening is, like we saw with Mulan, Disney's just simply doing business with China under the laws of the land, right? They're making their shareholders happy and all that kind of stuff. And then something happens where all the journalists are looking for a zinger. They find the zinger, right? And then the zinger gets overblown. You get senators yelling at Disney saying, you need to apologize and stop doing business with China. And then it inflates the problem in China to the point where they black out the movie from being seen over there because it's just a huge, embarrassing problem. And then you have consumers here in the US going, why am I going to go see a Disney movie when they're supporting this China regime, right? So we have to figure out what that unification is. And that will bring one other question I'm just going to throw to the crowd. And Ryan, you can figure out when to ask it. But I'm curious who the CCP wants to have win in November and who the Chinese people want to have win in November. And I think it's two different people.
David, yes, before I'll answer that, Chris, if they know that I am now 35 and can be on the write-in ballot, they would probably nominate me. I'm just going to say that. I would be the best China president ever. So, David, go ahead.
Yeah, Ryan, thanks. I just wanted to respond briefly to just a couple of points that have been made. Just a kind of a scatter shot of a few data points. Number one, on the polls that we talked about, I just want to flesh that out a little bit. In that Pew Research Center poll, a recent poll conducted of U.S. NATO allies in Japan, so 13 countries that are allies of the United States, major allies, 12 NATO, 1 Japan. A poll of the publics in those countries showed that about on average about 10-12% of the publics there held favorable views of President Trump. And interestingly enough, both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping polled higher than Trump among the publics of our NATO allies and our ally Japan. That, I think, is in fact not only a remarkable data point, but frankly a humbling data point that we have to keep in mind. So there is specific data behind this. It's not just general points that all of us are making. Our country is not faring well in the contestation of public opinion and public reputation in the world. And when we're losing to Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping among our NATO allies, I think that's a moment for self-reflection in our country and humility, very much as Bill just indicated. A couple of other things. A couple of folks have noted that China wants to accept no blame for anything. Well, neither do we. I mean, has anyone heard President Trump, Mike Pence, Secretary Pompeo, and others consistently refuse to take any responsibility for example, the handling of COVID-19 in this country? Yes, it originated in China, but it also originated in China relative to the 200 other countries in the world that have experienced COVID-19 outbreaks, and we're doing more poorly by most statistical measures than most of those countries, if not all of them. And so there's a notion that there's not a sense of U.S. responsibility as well. Yeah, sorry, Ling Ling.
But you have an independent press, right? Even though the administration officials haven't admitted anything, the press is holding you accountable.
Yes, and Ling Ling,
they don't have that.
And that is certainly true. Although I will say I have leveled criticism both in English and in Chinese in the Global Times, leveling direct criticism on China's early response to COVID-19. And it was published and not censored in any way. Now, that being said, you're absolutely right that our press environment is vastly more free than that of China. But the point that I'm making is narrower than that. It's that the Chinese administration doesn't accept blame for anything, and I think they're wrong not to. But it's also in a matter of fairness, and as Bill said, speaking the truth or seeking the truth from facts, it is also true that this administration has a great difficulty accepting responsibility as well. And I think we have to note that in a spirit of being objective and honest. The other thing that I would just mention, there are a lot of people, as Chris rightly noted, who are keen to beat up on U.S. companies, whether it's Disney, whether it's Google some years ago, whether it's Microsoft or other major league U.S. power players that are dealing with China, the Houston Rockets, the NBA, issues that Chris knows very, very deeply. But let me make this point. I think that if any U.S. political figure, someone in federal public office, the president, vice president, the 535 elected members of our U.S. Congress, want to criticize companies for quote outsourcing jobs to China, then I would like to see the tax returns of every single one of those individuals to know whether they are speaking from a place of authenticity or from a place of hypocrisy. Because if a certain senator is going to say to company A or company B, you shouldn't be outsourcing jobs to China, I'd sure as heck like to know if that senator owns stock in the company that he's publicly lambasting. And not one person yet has been willing to go on the public record and let their finances be a matter of public record so that the American people can judge whether they are being true to their values and living their values or whether they're being hypocritical. And I think that's something that has been absent in the discussion. The notion about holding China accountable is one thing. I think we have to hold our elected officials accountable and know whether they're telling us the truth or whether they're telling us a story.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to our next section. We're talking about trade, tariffs, technology. We've kind of touched that a little bit. We're kind of honing here. Two things. One, I know this is U.S. China, but I think it's pertinent. If you look at what China's done, especially early in the COVID pandemic, March, April, May, China was reaching out to Germany quite regularly. I think they made 4 phone calls, if I remember correctly, in the springtime compared to 1 to the U.S. So kind of a two-part question here. We've talked about, how, things we could do, but what role will the EU and Germany play in this relationship if the EU stands up and says, hey, no, China, what you're doing is not right? Referring to the poll y'all all referenced, a lot of EU nations are in there saying that they're not very favorable with China. Could the U.S. find an ally in the EU to stand up and to get China to kind of back off of some of the things that they've been pushing down their throat? And to be fair, if you read the commentary out of Germany, a lot of the German companies are mad because they made a lot of money by this business arrangement, and it's kind of coming back to bite them now. But so that's step one. And then also, I think Bill shared this morning. Henry Kissinger just said, I think it was this week, that the U.S. and China must establish rules of engagement. We've talked about that some. What are some ideas for some of those rules, and how might they work themselves out? We'll start with Bill. I think you're muted, Bill.
So on the trade stuff, I mean, I think the EU is right. They've been trying to negotiate an investment treaty for how long? And I think what you're seeing is a lot of fatigue in the EU, where like I think I think you reported this, or you and Bob reported this. Like Bob Lighthizer used to walk around with like a 5-page double-sided list of all the promises China had made on trade and didn't live up to. And I think the same thing, you get a similar feeling or reaction in the EU now. Sorry, you got to. Sorry?
That was Pottinger.
Oh, it was Pottinger. Oh, okay. Yeah. So, but he's right? I mean, it's not, but I think you're seeing this kind of promise fatigue in the EU where patience has run thin, because you've got, on the one hand, yes, you've got this big market and you've got German companies and other, making a lot of money, but at the same time, it's clearly not a level playing field. And now you're getting all these other issues that are coming in, and some of them have been forced by the Trump administration on sort of more of a sort of security strategic level. Some, though, just Xinjiang, the situation with the Uyghurs is deeply offensive to many of the European governments. Hong Kong obviously is an issue that the national security law that forced a lot of people to come out in Europe and have to basically say we're not happy with this. And so it's kind of all converging to a point where the dissatisfaction with and the willingness to apply more pressure on China has increased, I think, significantly in Europe. And yes, that they should be, I mean, they are allies of the US, but as David said earlier, from the Pew, you see that there's a lot of dissatisfaction or anger, or you could use probably less diplomatic terms, towards the US and specifically the Trump administration, that I think prevent more coordination between the EU and the US in terms of trying to address priority issues with China. That could very well change in a Biden administration, right? And we may see. I think we saw this when Obama won the Nobel Prize for doing nothing, right? He just wasn't George W. Bush, to be perfectly honest, right? I think you can see something very similar if you have a President Biden, where he comes in and all of a sudden everyone's like, oh my God, right? And then all of a sudden that the views towards the U.S. shift quite quickly, potentially, right? But so that was the EU point. Your other point. Sorry, what was your other question?
About Kissinger. We've talked about it some, but Kissinger said
Right.
That we should set some kind of guidelines, some standards that we're all going to play by, so we can kind of play together nicely, make it easy. What would some of those be?
It sounds great. That sounds great. I don't quite know. Again, it goes back to. I mean, I think one thing, like if I were talking to the folks, who were doing sort of Biden's China policy, I would say to them, look, you guys, you need to come up with a list of what are you bracket out the relationship, and what are our core interests, what are our red lines, what are the areas we can discuss, and what do we want what do we think the rules of the road should be, and call up Yang Jiechi and say, let's talk about this. Let's meet somewhere neutral and let's just sit down and we're not going to, if Biden wins November 4th, there are going to be all sorts of China think tankers and Fuing and those folks are going to be on the phone. They would fly it, but for the pandemic, they're going to be working every angle they can in DC, working the lobbyists here to convince the Biden administration to, January 21st, take off tariffs. The Biden administration needs to basically say, we need to sit down and we want to have a heart-to-heart with Beijing about what we want this relation to be, what they want it to be, and where we can find common ground. And if there is no common ground, that's one answer. If there is common ground that isn't just let's have 6 months of dialogue, that's another answer. But one thing the Biden administration shouldn't do is immediately come in and unilaterally step back from some of these things without getting anything from the Chinese side, because that will set a terrible precedent for the relationship going forward between the Biden administration and Beijing.
I think Ryan, who was on mute, just mentioned me, but I just want to say one thing in response to Bill's point. I don't necessarily mean to come in fully here, but on the tariffs, Bill, as I'm sure you know, and all of us on the call, Biden has already said that is something he would do if elected. He will remove the tariffs, not because that's good for China, but because that's good for America. We can talk more about that, but the notion, I just want to put on record, the notion that Fu Ying or any other Chinese think tanker or heavyweight would be calling and working with lobbyists in Washington, with Chinese lobbyists who are lobbying for Chinese interests to do that, that's not what's driving the Biden campaign's statement and position that they are opposed to tariffs. What's driving that is the fact that the tariffs are severely hurting the U.S. economy. And if in fact, and I would argue, just to your point, while your point I think is well taken, that in general, in negotiations with another country, one should not offer something for nothing. In the case of the tariffs, it's not about China. It's about us. It's about the damage that's being done to us. Those should be removed, not because it's giving something to China, but because it's giving something to our workers and our farmers and people all across our economy. So I just would flag that. That particular case is really about us, not about China.
Okay. Ling, Chris? Ling first. We'll go later.
Oh, okay. Ladies first, I guess. About the questions you ask about EU, what kind of role Europe and in particularly Germany could play in this whole relationship. I think Europe is between a hard and rock place as well when it comes to its relationship, both with the U.S. and relationship with China. On one hand, just like a lot of American businesses, a lot of European businesses also, still want to be in China, expand in China. They can't afford really to lose access to this giant Chinese market. So the argument for continued engagement with China in Europe is still very strong. On the other hand, Europe also shares the kind of concerns the U.S. has about China, right? As evidenced by really Beijing's action toward Hong Kong, toward Xinjiang. How the national security law in Hong Kong really became this rallying point for all those Western democratic countries in Europe, in Asia as well. It's sort of like a informal alliance between the U.S. and the rest of democratic world has come into being as a result of the Hong Kong action. I really think one way is, for the next administration, be it another Trump term or a new Biden term, at least try to go back to your allies and, work on issues that, they share common interest in. It's also in the longer term interest of China's own economy, right? The issues about tech transfer, IP protection, and industrial subsidies, SOE reform. If all those issues get addressed, it really benefit the Chinese economy in the long run. Although it could chip away, of course, at the party's control of the society in a lot of ways. So that's also one of the main reasons why the government has been so resistant in terms of carrying out any of those changes. So it's definitely much easier said than done. You can just form alliance and confront China as a unified force, because every country, let's face it, has its own national interests and economic interests. If it's so easy, I guess previous administration would have done that in more effectively and successfully, and Trump, probably wouldn't have made such a big a fuss over his unilateral approach, but at least the Chinese are very savvy about capitalizing on the kind of unilateral approach the U.S. has adopted. But again, the fact that they're not the Chinese leadership seems not really in mood or a position to make any kind of concessions. It's a perfect, window opportunity for all the countries that share the same kind of concerns about China to really work together.
Well, I agree with a lot of sentiment on this panel. And one other thing I'd add is when it comes to trade and implementing something that moves us forward in a constructive way, when you do a lot of business in China, you sort of always have to have that North Star of that like massive goal that you have down the road. But I think so many people get caught up in that North Star that they never get any of the baby steps that lead them there. So I sort of look at this problem as it's super complicated. So let's just come up with some baby steps that we can accomplish right off the bat, right? And maybe some of these are unicorn and rainbow, but South China Morning Post ran an op-ed about it this week that I wrote, and maybe we're making progress. And one of them is this cross-border censorship, or this inability for Americans to speak freely about criticism to China on our own soil has got to stop. That's something that is relatively new in the last decade. And they can firewall whatever we say over here. And we need to be able to have that pressure release. We need to have those First Amendment rights and those freedom of speech rights. Daryl Morey should not have been retaliated against for the whole league on behalf of what he said in Houston, Texas. Nor should Disney if they apologize here in the States about something they did with a card that showcased Xinjiang province officials. That's stuff that's a right that most Americans really feel is vital, and it creates a lot of noise when no one can speak up about this kind of stuff, and it creates all kinds of issues. So we need to back them off of that. They need to retreat. Number two is WTO standing, which we gave them the developing nation standing. We should change that to developed. I mean, enough is enough. Alexander Hamilton had the same issue with Europe, as I mentioned earlier. Like, it's time. They've caught up to us. Get that back up to the developed nation status. The SEC guidelines for access to our capital markets, we need to disallow them to use their state secret laws to hide behind secrets that they can't reveal in the standard sort of accounting procedures in order to have access to our markets. We need to nullify that, get them on the same standing that everybody else is that has access here, and just make it a traditional sort of level playing field. I mean, those are simple steps. And then there's all kinds of other ones that will lead us sort of to the coup de grace North Star. But we need to start with these baby steps, and we need to accomplish them ASAP.
Well, let me go ahead and move on, David. That's just really quick because we're a little bit behind schedule, but real quick.
Ryan, are we leaving the trade topic? Because if so, I just want to make a point.
Yeah,
but if
we're talking about tariffs really quick, so go ahead.
Okay, sorry, are we going to tariffs or are we?
Yeah, we're going to tariffs.
Okay, I have my comments about tariffs, so I'll hold off.
Yeah. Okay. So on tariffs in general, just looking at it from my background, which is energy, looking at the steel and how that's impacted. What we saw in the energy space was when the tariffs were talked about, a big rush of people going out to buy steel, and then all of a sudden it messed up the market. And of course, people here were frustrated with Trump or frustrated with China or whatever. Tariffs, obviously, as David said earlier, they hurt the consumer or the people in the United States when we're putting tariffs on stuff from China, but they also mess up a lot of other stuff. It's not as simple as just you're paying more for a good. It impacts jobs. It impacts project planning and stuff that we've seen. But this isn't a one-way street. China obviously does it to U.S. products and to other countries. How do we think about it? Because Trump is maybe seen to be an aggressor from the U.S. side of things, but I'm not sure that's a fair representation of what's actually going on, especially look at how China maybe handles Australia with taking their barley and moving it to another country.
Ryan, if I could come in on this, it's a really important question. Let me say a few things. First of all, fundamentally, tariffs are taxes, and they're taxes on, in this case, on Americans. They distort trade and they kill jobs. That's what tariffs do, and that's exactly what the data from the Trump administration itself has shown. So I want to just run through that because this is something that's really important, and it goes to the more fundamental question that you asked. What does the record show about the efficacy of Trump administration tariff policies in terms of U.S.-China trade? and their stated goal of reducing the deficit. Well, here's the data from the Trump administration. Number one, the U.S. Reached an all-time high in its trade deficit, merchandise deficit with China in 2018 under this president, $418 billion. Across this presidency, the average annual merchandise deficit with China is well in excess of any other average annual deficit of any other presidency in American history. So it's not just a one-year phenomenon. This entire presidency will log the highest average annual merchandise deficit with China in our nation's history. Furthermore, the U.S. under this administration has logged the number one and number two highest deficits in merchandise with the world that we've ever recorded since July 4th, 1776. Third, the U.S. has lost manufacturing jobs, 237,000 to be specific, based on federal, publicly available federal data, since January 20th, 2017. So we have fewer manufacturing jobs in this country today since Donald Trump took the oath of office. Fourth, in terms of agriculture, families are losing their farms. The government is giving a government handout worth about $28 billion thus far to farmers to partially offset income that they were making in greater amounts when they were able to trade with China. And as a result, this president has done something that everyone thought was undoable, unattainable. And that is he has turned a historic U.S. agricultural surplus with China into, for the first time since 1979, an agricultural deficit. Just this year that happened because of these policies. And finally, all of us are paying more at Walmart, Costco, and Target than we were 2 years ago, based on nonpartisan data to the tune of about $1,000 or maybe as much as $1,500 a year. The simple truth is, and the reason that neither President Trump nor Vice President Pence are talking about this in the debates, is because the factual empirical record from their data, from their administration's data, makes it very clear that every one of these policies has hurt the United States in what I refer to as a hurt America first, hurt America worst set of policies. The reason we need to get rid of tariffs is because they're bad for us, not because they're bad for China. And the Hippocratic Oath applies in public policy as well. First rule, do no harm to yourself. And yet that's what we've seen. One other point about the WTO. Like other countries, many other countries, we signed up to adhere to the rules of WTO. It's notable that just a few weeks ago, the WTO ruled, as some of us, myself included, publicly predicted 2.5 years ago, the WTO has ruled, and I think quite accurately and appropriately, that the U.S. tariffs are illegal under WTO. That is, they're illegal under the rules that we ourselves say that we accept. So not only are they bad for our country and generating higher deficits, lost farms, reduced manufacturing employment opportunities, and the list goes on, but they're also illegal under the rules that we are telling China to obey and to adhere to. These policies have been horrible for our country. And so I want to just make the point, Ryan, as I close on this point, to address your question. Does China do some things that are wrong and inappropriate, unlawful, illegal? Do they game the system? Absolutely, yes, 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 and yes to all of those questions. The problem is that the set of policies that this administration has adopted to remedy that real problem has generated a status quo that is worse for our country than the status quo that would have obtained had we done nothing. In other words, the Trump administration has come up with a solution to the problem. The only problem is that the solution is worse than the problem was in the first place.
Is Ryan on mute?
Oh, it's me. Sorry, I'm sitting here talking to myself. Ling Ling, I said, I was going to you. Do you agree with what David said?
Yes, I do.
Oh, now she's on. Now you're. There you go. There you go. Sorry.
Oh,
there you go. Yes, go ahead.
Do you have a different question for me, or?
Yeah. So it's the same question, and then if you want to expound upon where David left off at.
Oh, well, certainly David is quite an expert on that very topic. I don't have much to add on. Sorry.
Yeah, Bill or Chris?
Just I'd add one thing on the not arguing or not disagreeing with David's points about tariffs, but politically, especially if it's a Biden administration, there are a lot of Democrats on the Hill who like the idea of tariffs, and doesn't mean that's good policy. But from a political perspective, domestically, I think it's difficult for Joe Biden to walk in on day one, get rid of the tariffs. I think that's something that has to be considered. I can see sort of intellectually, yes, we should do it because it's better for the U.S. economy, but I think there may be some political constraints. I also would say, though, that just because the U.S. drops the tariffs, are we assuming that Beijing will drop the counter tariffs that are affecting exports of, say, farm goods to China? Or are we going to, or is there going to be some sort of a negotiation? Because if Biden comes in and says all the tariffs are off and China hasn't agreed to do anything, that is not, I don't think, an effective policy and does not set a good stage for the next 4 years or 8 years or whatever it is of a Biden administration policy towards China.
Bill, the only thing I would just say briefly in response is that even if the Biden administration came in and unilaterally lifted tariffs and China did absolutely nothing in response, the United States would be far better off than if we kept those tariffs in place. I know it's hard for people, and I'm not saying people in this group, because I know you understand these issues. It's hard perhaps for the average American maybe to understand that. People want perhaps a kind of emotional response. But looking at this clinically and looking at this in terms of what it does to deficits and what it does to jobs, which is that tariffs inflate deficits and kill jobs. That's what the data shows. Then even if China did nothing, just unilaterally getting rid of these job-killing and in some cases life-killing tariffs would be a smart thing for the U.S. to do. That said, I agree with your broader point. Still, the United States needs to work in any case with China to rectify some of these unjustifiable and improper asymmetries in the relationship, of which there are many. But even if China did nothing, we'd still be better off unilaterally getting rid of the tariffs. Optically, that's one thing, but substantively, the data is in after 4 years, not one, but 4, and the data couldn't be clearer on that topic.
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty clear the U.S. has lost the trade war. I mean, I'll let Ling literally wrote the book on it, but it sure looks like it's been pretty much a disaster.
Well, and by the way, I'd go back to what I was saying earlier is like, we can go back to the way it was if we just bend over and keep taking it up the, you know what, it's just going to get worse and worse. I mean, what you're essentially saying is, David, is to go back to what we were previously, which wasn't good either, right? So, I mean, I look at just the Hollywood business. I mean, we get 25 cents every dollar. It's half of what the rest of the world gives us for our movies. They only allow 32 movies into the market every year, which is ridiculous. And on top of it, that's for the whole world. It's not even for Hollywood. And that's just the Hollywood business. And try buying a car over there. It costs you 3 times as much money as it would here. We have to have, and Bill brought it up earlier, reciprocity. I mean, there has to be some sort of give and take. We can't just like say, hey, guess what? Tariffs no more. We're going to go back to where we were prior, which was a mess too. And it's only getting messier and they're only gaining more leverage. And once they're the biggest economy in the world, forget it. We're never going back. So one thing we have to do is be able to stomach the fact that stock markets are definitely going to get hurt. We're going to lose revenue growth. We're going to lose profit growth while we go through the disruptive manner of resetting, rebalancing this relationship. But we either do it or we don't. I mean, that's really the bottom line. If we just want to go back to the way it was, that's great. That's good short-term thinking, but it's going to screw us in the 10-year process. And they're on a 25, 50, 100-year central planning timeline. So they got all the time in the world to take it over, right? So that's where the issue is.
Yeah, we're moving towards central planning in this country, and that's one of the things among many about this administration that concern me. A lot of the things that I hear President Trump say literally come from Das Kapital, from Karl Marx, the notion of making the pie smaller, spreading it more equitably, and having us all be poorer together. That's the central tenet of this administration's economic policy. It didn't work very well for the Soviet Union. It doesn't work well for most truly communist countries, and I think it's a bad path for us. I think we need to stick with the principles of the free market that have made this country the #1 economy in the world. And one of the things that makes us the #1 economy in the world is generally a history of not doing things that hurt ourselves more than they hurt others. And that's a test that I think we failed under this administration.
Okay, let's one more for this section. We got to move on. We are a little bit behind schedule here. So Huawei, TikTok, WeChat. Okay, so I don't know much about TikTok. It's a bunch of dancing videos, but apparently it was or is potentially a security threat. Obviously, Huawei seems to be, depending on where, even the BBC I read this morning is saying that local officials in the UK are saying that it's a potential security threat. WeChat, obviously, it can be heavily censored. What are your guys' thoughts on that, and how should we think about that? Maybe not necessarily whether we agree with the policy or not, but are they really security threats for Americans? Because that's mainly the concern on this side of the border. If you're in China, then you're kind of used to knowing what you're dealing with. Man, whoever wants to take it first, go ahead.
I'll just say a couple of words. All these are very topical issues, certainly in the news. They're kind of distinct issues here. I don't think the issue with WeChat is censorship per se. Yes, the Chinese powers that be have access to whatever is on WeChat. That is well known and has been from the beginning. But that's not the issue from the standpoint of the U.S. From a U.S. perspective, or applying a U.S. lens, the issue is the integrity of personal information that may be collected on WeChat, right. The type of information that a Facebook or that a Twitter or other U.S. social media collect, or Google or others. And so the question is, does China have access to that information? And if it does, and I believe it does, then does that create security issues from the standpoint of the American population, those who are using that particular platform? Likewise for TikTok, I think those two issues revolve around the integrity of data that is collected about folks that are using those particular applications. I think the concerns around that are legitimate. But I also think there is a reason why U.S. judges in U.S. courts have put an injunction on Trump administration policies, and that is because this appears to be a case where a very clumsy sledgehammer approach is being adopted for an issue that requires a more surgical and clinical approach. And that's why U.S. judges in U.S. courts hearing cases from U.S. citizens have put a stop, at least for now, to the Trump administration's efforts to try to, in a sense, exert government control over the markets to tell these private companies who they can partner with, what commercial terms they can operate on, and so on. Again, we've seen that playbook before. That's the Chinese playbook. And now we're doing it in this country. And that's why U.S. judges in U.S. courts ruling on cases raised by U.S. citizens are finding these approaches problematic. But let me say something about Huawei, because Huawei is a different type of issue. Huawei is not the issue of data privacy. It's the issue of can the Chinese powers that be put backdoors and other illicit functionalities into this type of gear or this type of network equipment that would then compromise U.S. communications and the communications of both official and private Americans? And the answer is yes, that theoretically can happen. And it is a legitimate concern, and I believe the concern is well placed, and that we as a nation need to work through that, look at that clinically, not emotionally, and come up with solution sets that protect the integrity of our communications. But let's also point out something that we don't often talk about, but that I do talk about in my remarks on this topic, and that is the reason that we're fearful of what China might do with respect to Huawei is because we already did it with respect to Cisco. Everything we think that China may do in the future, we've already done. That's a matter of documentary record. It's been laid out in the Edward Snowden leaks from about 6 years ago, I believe. And the fact is, everything we're fearful that China may do, we've done. And I think we have to be humbled by that fact and recognize that we shouldn't be speaking from a position of moral superiority or from the sort of self-claimed high ground of moral authority. Look, it's a legitimate issue, but let's recognize that we've done it as well. and therefore let's address it in a business-like way.
Yeah, it's funny, real quick.
So
Bill, real quick.
I was going to say, no, your point on Huawei is, I mean, I've written about it. The U.S. doesn't need a smoking gun for Huawei because the U.S. knows better than anybody what Huawei can do because we've done it. And as you said, it's been documented not just by the Snowden stuff. And so that doesn't, again, that can be fine, and people can say, "Oh, well, the U.S. is just as bad," and what about? But the reality is we know they can do it because we've done it. So therefore, do you? Then it goes back to the broader question of: do you want your telecom network to be run by effectively the Chinese Communist Party, or do you want it to be run by effectively the Five Eyes Alliance? Some people will say Five Eyes is better. Some people will say, well, maybe it should be CCP. But that is the issue, I think, not whether or not we found the smoking gun in Huawei. I will just say on the TikTok and WeChat stuff, the executive orders for both TikTok and WeChat were horribly drafted. I actually had a call with some officials who work on these issues, and it was the day after the EOs were issued, and I asked them what they meant, and they said, "We're still reading them. We're trying to figure it out." Literally, it was like they said, and then you see, obviously, the court cases, and the reason why the courts issued these injunctions is because the EOs were crap. The process for TikTok is disgusting and grotesque. It is the worst of the worst when it comes to corrupt crony capitalism. It's basically trying to, effectively strip TikTok from ByteDance and give it to big Trump donors, and not just Oracle, but the U.S. VC private equity funds that have a lot of money in TikTok that are big donors with a lot of connections to the Trump administration. It is disgusting. You can argue a separate discussion about the merits of the national security issues, which I think are real. I think WeChat has a bigger problem than TikTok because of not only its ability to collect data. Most Americans don't use it, but there's a large, the entire Chinese diaspora globally uses it, and it creates this information bubble that is effectively the PRC information sphere virtually extended globally. And so if you're on WeChat and you're using WeChat, your whole information diet, it's not just censorship, it's disinformation, it's propaganda, and you can live in that environment. And I have plenty of friends who do here, and that's all you can do. And that is effectively, to Chris, your point earlier about sort of PRC censorship in the US, this is it's this very significant extension of that opens up all sorts of possibilities for disinformation, manipulation. Did you lose me? I'm frozen. Disinformation, manipulation, election interference. TikTok, I think, you have 13-year-old twins. I have 14-year-old twins who were born in Beijing. I hate TikTok for those reasons. But in terms of sort of the potential national security implications, I think there's a lot of focus on the data and the ability of a PRC control company to get the data. That's legitimate. I think the bigger issue is the recommendation algorithms, because we have no idea how they work, and they could very easily be manipulated for what we would see as nefarious purposes. And it is a problem. Should it be completely blocked? Do we want to go down the road that China went down? No. And we're not having a sensible discussion in this country about sort of broader issues around internet, data, privacy, things like that. This is sort of a knee-jerk, non-strategic approach, which I think, unfortunately, is symptomatic of a lot of what we see in the Trump administration.
Ling, do you have anything to add? If not, we'll go on to our next section.
By the way, I was just going to say, Bill's been covering the TikTok situation right on the money. I mean, you've been calling out all different sides. I do think TikTok, yes, I'm annoyed by it with my kids, but it is a big data issue. I mean, there's so much data on there. And yes, my kids are 13, but they're going to be of voting age in 5 years. I mean, the amount of AI development that can harvest that hard data in 5 years, who knows what they're going to be able to do with it.
What their preferences are, and then how they can manipulate it back to them. Yeah, no, but it's not like, my kids live here and therefore I don't think that's the data that's so problematic.
No, but it will guide you down rabbit holes. Like if you go on there, you can literally suck up 2 hours of a day and not realize it because it's sucking you in different influencing areas. That's very powerful. And we see it with the marketing business and advertising. And who knows how it can be used in 5 years. And I will say, like we talk about Trump and how and I'm very nonpartisan with all this stuff, but like, if you look at Trump, he brings to attention big things that need to get addressed, right? And then he comes out and he bull in the China shops, does something about it. It at least brings to attention the problem to everybody. But then what happens is, in like this TikTok situation, even if there wasn't crony capitalism, this solution, if it was just completely fair, is like a Four Seasons management company taking over a hotel owned by the Chinese. The Chinese still own it. They still have the algos. They still have everything that we were worried about in the security concern. WeChat, I think, is actually a little more sinister in a way. And Ling Ling, I know you know this, but WeChat is just so used by Chinese nationals here on the ground in the US and around the world. And it's got financial economic applications, which are a whole nother security concern. But I actually feel like part of that was a little bit of a spite play with WeChat to get back at Chinese nationals and to make a statement and all that kind of stuff. But it is sort of TikTok at the next level. And then Huawei obviously is a network level, which is a whole nother security threat. So all these need to be addressed, but they need to be addressed in a uniform, sort of organized manner. And it's going to need more than just executive orders to get it done right.
Okay. All right. Let's try to, this is getting a lot of good feedback, a lot of questions. So we'll try to shorten our answers down a little bit for these next few sections because we are behind schedule. I will say someone did comment, that comparing Snowden and his revelation to Huawei was not a fair comparison. And I will say I met with a former CIA person when I was in China last November, and they openly disdained the Snowden revelations because they told the world about exactly what you are talking about. And so it may not be a 1-2-1 per se, but there was a lot of contempt over that issue because from his perspective, because we were talking to them about China and Huawei and the threats, and he was talking about how big of a threat it is. We said, "What about what you guys do or did?" He goes, "Oh man, Snowden ruined all that for us." We're like, "Whoa!" so anyway, so for the person that says Snowden's not a fair comparison, that's more of what we're referring to. Is that from the U.S. intelligence side of things, that was a problem. Okay, we're gonna go to Hong Kong and Taiwan. Hong Kong was kind of dominating the news. Taiwan is creeping in here. Tensions seem to be boiling. This from the outside perspective, from the U.S. side perspective, what role can the U.S. play with Hong Kong and Taiwan? Is there anything that they can do to actually de-escalate these situations, or is anything going to be looked as, or is everything that the U.S. tries to do look as an aggressive move and something that China will push back on automatically? Ling Ling, we'll start with you.
You're on mute, Ling Ling.
Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. So in terms of Hong Kong, so far the actions taken by the Trump administration, it just gave me a feeling that as if they were really punishing Hong Kong and Hong Kong people. I don't feel like the power that's really responsible for the Hong Kong security law, getting any kind of punishment or taking any kind of consequences as a result of their actions. I'm just I just wanted to maybe if I ever get a chance to talk to the administration, just really lay out, what are the plans you have in mind in terms of how to help Hong Kong and the people in Hong Kong, not, instead of having policies that really, stripping Hong Kong of the special status, trading status, really not helping Hong Kong in any way. You're punishing Hong Kong, the people in Hong Kong. So that's one thing I wanted to really get some clarity about if I ever got a chance to talk to the administration. I mean, from China's perspective, later for the latter half of last year, Hong Kong had emerged as much bigger issue than the U.S.-China trade negotiations. as we find out now, the Beijing's leadership started to the whole process of drafting the national security law as early as last fall. Because Xi Jinping really thought, what's happening in Hong Kong, the protests, the raging protests, pro-democracy protests, is a serious threat to his leadership. So, he gave Carrie Lam one last chance in September, basically summoned her to Beijing and told her to, just give the protesters one compromise, get rid of, withdraw the extradition bill and see what you can do. And she went back to Hong Kong, withdrew the extradition bill, but still did very little, nothing basically to calm the situation. So that's when Xi Jinping decided to take the matter into his own hand, imposing the law, bypassing the Hong Kong legislature. That just shows how determined he is in terms of, maintaining, protecting what he sees as a core interest of the party. Obviously, he also did another thing at the same time, which was instructing Liu He to keep talking to American trade negotiators to cut a deal with the Americans, hooking Trump on trade as being the government, the Xi Jinping strategy all along. And, that's part of the evidence of that strategy. Obviously, you may, during the pandemic, despite the health issues in Beijing, went ahead and held the NPC session, National Party's Congress, and pushed through the Hong Kong security law. Just showed how determined the top leader was. In terms of maintaining the bottom line and the sovereignty issue, and obviously the thinking, at least a bit of that at the time was we can use the trade deal as some sort of leverage with the Trump administration, so that they wouldn't push too hard over issues that Beijing sees very little room for negotiation, like the sovereignty issues involving Hong Kong. However, yet again, the Chinese leadership backfired, and the action backfired. The Hong Kong action really stirred up quite a backlash from all over the world, not just in the U.S. But again, yes, in the U.S. action one by one seems quite intense. But my question is, you're not punishing those really responsible for this. You're really hurting Hong Kong and people in Hong Kong. Have you ever thought of a more surgical and targeted plan that could hold Beijing responsible, accountable for the action, as opposed to this kind of it looks very aggressive, but kind of a plan that really it's having different kind of impact. So that would be my take.
Bill, how are you?
Well, I was going to say on Hong Kong, I mean, the U.S. has, and the rest of the world has very few options. It certainly could make it easier for people from Hong Kong who want to leave to come to the U.S. or other countries. But in terms of sanctions, sort of undoing the special relationship with Hong Kong ultimately, I think, hurts many people in Hong Kong. It certainly, sort of fits the we have to do something. But so, the U.S. could be more aggressive in targeting, sanctions against sort of major PRC financial institutions, but that causes a whole bunch of other problems, both with the U.S.-China relationship overall, as well as in the global financial system. And so it seems like the U.S. has really been quite reticent to use those tools because I think at least some people in the administration, like probably Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, who are worried that those could have a pretty significant impact globally. So I don't know what the U.S. at this point can do when it comes to Hong Kong. I mean, it is part of PRC, right? There's no question about the sovereignty over Hong Kong, and it is very unfortunate what has happened. But short of letting any Hong Kongers who want to leave and come to the U.S. or Canada or the EU, the UK, what else can the U.S. really do at this point that has any sort of teeth that doesn't actually hurt the people, like you were saying, Li-Ling, hurt the people we think the U.S. wants to help? I don't know.
Yeah, Chris, anything to add there?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I was there with 3 congressional members in September of last year, and it seemed like the U.S. had their eye on the ball and was focused on making sure what happened over the last, 8 months wouldn't happen. But we got distracted, and I think, like Bill and Lingling said, it's sort of what's happened, and there's really no going back. I think what just happened to Hong Kong should be a wake-up call to us, where we're focused now on Taiwan, because that's the next place they're going to utilize essentially the same techniques. And if we get distracted again, we're going to see something similar go down. And unfortunately, that's going to be a much bigger issue in that region. So we need to think about this. We need to learn from our mistakes and figure out how to apply them moving forward with a very big ally of ours that we don't really officially recognize, but we do recognize.
David, I want you to answer, but I also want to hear a little bit more about Taiwan from your perspective as well.
Thanks, Ryan. A couple of things. First, I fully agree with Lingling and also Bill, and I think Chris was agreeing with a lot of this as well. I do agree that I think in the U.S. response to what happened in terms of Taiwan, in terms of Hong Kong, too much of what the United States has done or proposed doing would punish the victim. And that is problematic, because not only does it hurt the good people of Hong Kong who had nothing to do with this law being placed on the books, it actually hurts us yet again, because Hong Kong is one of our major trading partners in its own right. And the Hong Kong economy is one of the largest and most vibrant economies in the world, a linchpin of the economy and the financial transactions in Asia. And again, I would make 2 points. One, I don't think the administration was considering the second and third order effects of a policy and the way that they affect people who were the victims, not the perpetrators of the launching of the Hong Kong national security law. And number two, I don't think anyone in the administration really thought through the degree to which these policies would hurt us. So I fully agree with Lingling's point, and the point that's been, I think, echoed by others. With respect to Taiwan, I would say a couple of things. One, and let me just make a point about the national security law. I've said repeatedly publicly that I think the national security law is very, very problematic for a number of fundamental reasons. Number one, vague definitions of the fundamental classes of criminal behavior that are addressed there. And number two, and in particular from a U.S. perspective, the extraterritorial jurisdictional reach of the law to every person on the planet is, I think, immensely problematic. And I think it's an audacious overreach that is, as I would say, it's something that even the United States doesn't do. It's terribly problematic, and it's one of a number of areas in the law that I think are not well, in my judgment, thought through and problematic and perhaps meriting some type of reconsideration or retooling. With respect to Taiwan, let me just say a couple of things. Number one, what's happened over the summer in Hong Kong, I think, clearly makes a mockery of the notion of one country, two systems. And it drives home a point that I've talked about for many years, probably 20 years at least, really going back to the mid-90s. And that is that the way that people in the mainland, and particularly the mainland leadership, look at Hong Kong and the way that people in Taiwan look at Hong Kong are diametrically opposed. Historically, the mainland looks at Hong Kong and says to compatriots in Taiwan, look, one country, two systems works. Wouldn't you love to have one country, two systems? And the people in Taiwan look at Hong Kong and see what has happened in Hong Kong in terms of one country, two systems as an abject failure and a great definition of exactly what they would never want. And what's happened in Hong Kong this summer, I think, just underscores that. And as I said on Capitol Hill 6 years ago, I'll say again today, if the people of Taiwan wanted one country, two systems, they would already have it. So I think this does damage to Hong Kong in certain ways, does damage to the notion of the basic law and the 50-year agreement. It does damage to U.S.-China relations. It hurts the good people of Hong Kong. It hurts U.S.-Hong Kong commercial ties. But perhaps most fundamentally from a mainland perspective, I think it really, really sets back the mainland's stated cause and objective with respect to what they would refer to as reunification with Taiwan.
Okay, we are up against the clock. We got about 10 minutes left. We had some questions. I'm going to try to run through. I'll just ask an individual panelist to answer. We'll just go back to you real quick, David, since you were talking about Taiwan. Let's see here. The question is, I do want to know what we expect China to do if the U.S. is aggressive in establishing a formal relationship with Taiwan.
Well, let me say this. First of all, I don't think the United States will recognize the Republic of China as our formal diplomatic bilateral partner. Obviously, doing so would, by definition, mean that we are de-recognizing the People's Republic of China. While a closure of a consulate general certainly might to some seem like a step in that direction, I don't think that's where even this administration is going. And so I don't think that you're going to see something qualitatively different than what we've seen in recent years and months. What we have seen is a U.S. desire to enhance our, quote, unofficial contact with Taiwan through high-level visits such as that by the HHS Secretary and an Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth and Energy recently. And we'll continue to see those kinds of things. I don't think we're going to see it go further than that. We'll continue to see arms sales, U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, which I support and have for many years, and we'll see that continue. However, to take the premise of your question just briefly, if the United States were to go further than that and say, hey, we're going to formally recognize the Republic of China, then you would see it would be the most important global story of the last 25 years, maybe with the exception of 9/11 itself. But it would be a world-changing and global economy-changing occurrence. China would react to that in myriad ways, but not least the diplomatic relationship between the United States and China would be severed, and a whole host of cascading things would happen flowing from that.
Okay. Let's see. Ling Ling, we'll go to you on this one. If the U.S.-China relationship deteriorates, it's worse, how much is that going to depend on Xi's behavior? So in other words, how much responsibility would you put on his side of the equation?
Probably a lot. So it's, again, it takes two to tango. If the relationship completely collapses, I don't think you can just blame solely on one side. It's obviously, if you talk to Chinese officials these days, as Bill mentioned earlier, they always say the U.S. is the blame for everything. So that really is not, if you really want to solve the problem, improve the situation, that's really not the way to go. I really think and hope, cooler heads in Beijing will prevail as well. Try to, step back a little bit. But it's really hard for them to do because to do something impulse is very strong in China, probably just as strong in Washington these days as well. However, I do still think, just to go back to one of the earlier points all of us have made, that there's still some constraints on Xi in terms of how hard to hit back at the U.S. And the biggest constraint of all is himself, his own desire to stay in power, basically unchallenged.
Okay. Let's see here. Bill, we'll go to you, then we'll go to you next, Chris. So, Bill, to you, what's the TPP exactly mean to combat China's economic control? I'm sorry, was the TPP meant to combat Chinese economic control?
Well, I think it was actually meant to shape Chinese behavior, to force reforms in the Chinese economy, to bring them more in line with the global trading rules the U.S. and the other signatories wanted. And I think the hope was that, the U.S. was taking the lead in shaping, continuing to shape some of the global trading rules, and that it would force China to come along. The TPP, I think, is a dead issue at this point. I don't think there's any I think it'd be very difficult for a Biden administration to join the TPP, given the Congress and given the Democrat. I think, and that ship has sailed. I think what we're seeing a lot on, in Asia is that the other members of the TPP are now they have their own. What's it called? They've changed the name, but they're basically working on their own agreement without the U.S. and without China, and that is something we talk about this as sort of U.S. China, but and especially in the region of Asia, we're seeing a lot more linkages and work between other Asian countries. But, many of them share the same concerns the U.S. or similar concerns the U.S. does towards China, but they're also China's neighbors, and they're too small to not have at least a positive economic relationship with China. And so they're trying to figure out, especially given sort of the U.S. trajectory now, I think there's a lot of questioning about whether or not they can rely on the U.S. And one thing I want to add, just while I got a minute, is around U.S. policy. One of the dumbest things the U.S. is doing is shutting our borders to Chinese people. There absolutely are reasons to be concerned and reasons to go after some of the scientific exchanges and theft and misbehavior, but that is a small fraction of what's going on. And the blanket approach the Trump administration has taken is absolutely weakening the U.S. and strengthening China. Absolutely. And it is insanity.
Yeah. Okay.
I couldn't agree more.
Agreed. Yes, as well. Okay, Chris, to you, this is back to the Hong Kong security laws, but it ties into some of your previous workings, at least in media. I've seen some reports where news organizations are considering moving their operations because of new Hong Kong security laws. What do we make of that? Do we think that media companies, news organizations will be moving out of Hong Kong, relocating maybe out of China altogether, or is it kind of a wait and see approach?
I think it's a wait and see approach. I mean, I was pleasantly surprised that South China Morning Post ran my op-ed the other day. Mark Magnier, who I think a lot of us know, who's with Politico and them, is waiting to see what the independence situation continues to be or not. But right now, if you are reading it on a daily basis, it does seem to still have criticisms towards Beijing, and I'm curious myself to see if it continues. And I think that would be the same with every other publication out of there, and whether they're going to have the freedoms that they were used to a year ago.
Okay, we'll do two more questions. One is about Iran and how does China and their dealings with Iran impact U.S.-China relations? I will say, obviously, right before we got on, there was some news about the Trump administration with Iran. I don't know if you guys caught that. I didn't see what's going on there. But from an energy perspective, it's not a very good look, at least if you agree with what Trump's policy is there. And so I don't see how it can help U.S.-China relations. And furthermore, because the way we treat Iran, it's going to make China look as if they're partnering with our enemy, not just a bad trade partner. It's going, the Trump administration could really pound that home. David, Lingley, whoever, I'll let you respond to that.
Just very briefly, Ryan, on that point, I would say that obviously this administration takes a very different approach to Iran than the previous administration. That's certainly this administration's prerogative. They pulled out of the Iran agreement. That came up in the debate last night, for example. And so this administration is taking a much more adversarial approach to Iran rather than an approach that focuses on how to slow Iran's presumptive march toward a nuclear weapons capability. Iran figures for China in a number of different ways. By the way, one should note that in recent years, there's actually been a pretty high level of constructive collaboration and commonality of interest between the United States and China with respect to the topic of Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons and what was then for 8 years the Obama administration's overall approach to Iran, which was focusing on negotiations, focusing on reducing the threat of proliferation and so on. So there's actually historically been some commonality of interest, and Iran was one of those areas where there was relatively little disagreement between the United States and China. Where that is, I think, different now, but I think where Iran comes into play is the United States has proven to be an unreliable partner to China in a number of different ways, changing laws, changing the policy framework, having policy made by tweets. Any given moment of the day, you could see a 180-degree shift in major U.S. policy. And so the notion of the U.S., the question of energy becomes very central. whereas I believe that the United States should be a major supplier of energy to China. Now there's a lot less confidence on the part of China in the United States' ability to provide that. And therefore, Iran, which has always figured importantly in China's energy mix, particularly petroleum, now figures all the more importantly. So the Iran piece of U.S.-China relations, I think, is there. Let me just say one last thing before I close. There's a contradiction in in President Trump's views toward China. I just want to say this one sentence. In 2017, he said that China had destroyed our economy and brought our nation to our knees. Not exact words, the exact sentiment. He had wrecked and destroyed our nation and our economy by stealing manufacturing jobs. In that same week, before a single tariff was applied to the Chinese imports, he said the U.S. economy was stronger than it had ever been in all of our nation's history. Which is it? That conundrum, I think, is an interesting one to ponder over.
Okay, this is the last question. We will start with Bill, go to Ling Ling, we'll go to Chris, and we'll let David close it out. And this is taken from a question we got from one of the viewers. And if you were an advisor to President Trump or potential President Biden, and let's just say you could give them one piece of advice, just one piece of advice, how to repair whatever it might be with the U.S.-China relationship, what would it be? So your answer, and then also one more time where people can find more about you. So your newsletter, your book, and actually I got this book right here. I was looking at my stack. There's my copy. So I got Ling Ling's book laying around. Chris, I got yours on Kindle. That's why I couldn't find it earlier. So anyways, so Bill, we'll start with you. If you were the advisor to Biden and Trump, and we're going to pretend like they're going to actually listen, what would be the one piece of advice that you would give them?
The easy question. One piece of advice.
Stop.
One piece of advice would actually to try and put together a whole of government survey about the relationship with China and what the costs are of pursuing different courses, from trying to go back to the past to pursuing a much more contentious policy. Because I don't think that we as American people, and I'm not sure as the U.S. government, have a real understanding of what the costs are going to be of a much more contentious relationship with China. And maybe we have no choice on that, but it certainly doesn't feel like that is well understood inside or has been explained well to the American population, the American populace. And for me, my newsletter is at sinocism.com, SINOCISM.com, and there's my background's on there, and hope you sign up. I like it.
It's very good.
Have me. Can't hear you.
You're muted.
Can you hear me now? Oh, sorry. My piece of advice would be hire people who understand China to advise you on the China policy. As we discussed earlier, the kind of a blanket ban, blanket approach, blanket sanctions aimed at China just really not working. You're hurting a lot of people you're purposely trying to protect. So, trying to be more targeted, more effective. That the key is to hire people who really understand China, how China works.
And Wall Street Journal, your book, where?
Sure, for sure. Of course, please, we continue to write about China, obviously from different angles. I write for the Wall Street Journal. Obviously, if you can subscribe to the journal, that's how you support quality journalism. And for myself and my partner, Bob Davis, this is a book we worked really, really hard on. So thank you, Bill.
I'll get our copies out.
Thank you, Bill, very much, and really appreciate it. And if you can read it, really appreciate it. And obviously, Bill's newsletter, Sinocism, is hugely informative. I read it every day. That's how I basically keep my updates about what's going on in China in the elite leadership circles as well.
Okay, Chris, and then let David close out.
My advice to Mr. the President would be look, the Chinese are practical. They actually are pretty good negotiators. But if you cause a face issue right off the bat, it becomes very, very difficult. They're backed in a corner, and it's very difficult to get any sort of give and take going. So maybe try a different approach. You can still carry a big stick, but try to keep face saved in the process, because you can get a lot more traction that way. I'm at the Dragon Feeder for Twitter. Here's my book. Bill says he's got his downstairs, but it's Feeding the Dragon.
It's a very good book, but yes, it's downstairs. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a fun read. It's sort of like a Michael Lewis type memoir. And I think you'll get some interesting sort of educational lessons out of it while being entertained. And you can go on feedingthedragonbook.com, and it's got all my media hits and everything else on there. So thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Ryan, thank you. So just a couple of things. If I were advising President Trump, I'd say a few things. Number one, of course, it would be futile, I recognize, but be fact-based, look at the facts, and look at the bottom line results, not just the process and the rhetoric and the tweets. Look at how the policies actually affect our nation and apply one metric. Do they advance the interests of our nation or not? And make policy based on the interests of the United States of America, not whatever emotion someone is feeling that particular day. I would also echo Ling Ling's excellent advice. Put people in charge of policy who understand it. The fact that manufacturing policy is led by someone who's never lived in the real economy, never been in manufacturing, and never held a job outside of academia is emblematic of why our country has lost 237,000 manufacturing jobs since Donald Trump took the oath of office. So there are lots of room for improvement, but I think being fact-based, let me say, the untethering of American public discourse from factual reality is the greatest threat that our nation faces today. Because without factual reality, we can't properly address any of the policy challenges that are in front of us. If I were advising Biden, I would just say, Mr. President-elect, get rid of the tariffs as soon as you possibly can, help put Americans back to work, and yes, be realistic and keep in mind American interests, work hard to negotiate with the Chinese. They're tough negotiators. We can be as well. But the first rule of public policy, don't make things worse. And I think that we can achieve that by getting rid of the tariffs on day one.
Okay, I know we are over, so I will not yak. I will just simply say my piece of advice is to have more conversations like this, because these are helpful. You hear different perspectives, different nuances. And so thank you guys for this. And as I always say, these are always hard to balance who gets how much time. So I hope I did well at that. If not, it was not personal. I apologize. Y'all did a very good job. Thank you so much to the viewers. We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.